Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. Sherlock Holmes received an unusually urgent visitor on one of those gloomy January mornings when London appears to be swallowing its own inhabitants in soot and fog. I recall the day vividly because I had just set down my medical journal and was settling into the armchair by the fire when the bell rang out in 3 sharp bursts, each more impatient than the last. Holmes was sprawled languidly across the settee, his violin abandoned nearby, clearly having spent the early hours in a melancholic musical reverie. "Mrs. Hudson," he said without moving, "is about to usher in someone who smells faintly of engine oil and coal dust." The door flew open almost simultaneously with his announcement. A stocky man, no more than 50 years old, his face ruddy and lined from years of exposure to the elements, walked in with barely a nod. "Mr. Holmes, forgive the intrusion, but there's something happened on the Birmingham line that has everyone at the London and North Western Railway scratching their heads raw." "Then you must be Mr. Godfrey Milbank," Holmes said, finally sitting up and tucking his fingers under his chin. "The LNWR's Southern Freight Operations Superintendent was recently promoted. Congratulations," the man blinked. "How in blazes?" "Your boots have a thin crust of Staffordshire red clay. Your railway issue overcoat was recently stitched. And your left wrist has a slight depression, most likely caused by a watch chain that was removed in haste." Milbank seemed to shake off his astonishment. "Right. Well, I haven't come for admiration. Something's gone very wrong. We had a supply train, midnight number 4017, set off last night from Liverpool bound for Euston. It passed through Rugby at 2:12 a.m., confirmed by the station master there. But when it arrived at the Camden yards this morning at dawn..." He hesitated, and even Holmes leaned forward. There was no one aboard. No conductor, no engineer. Not a soul. And no signs of forced entry or struggle. The train completed its run perfectly. On schedule, brake systems intact, lamps lit, and cargo sealed. But it was quite literally unmanned. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Most extraordinary," he whispered. I shifted in my seat. "You're certain no stops were made?" "No tampering." Milbank shook his head. "None. The entire route is signaled and logged. Every signal cabin on the route confirms she passed without incident. It's as if the crew simply vanished into the night." There was a prolonged hush. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, peering into the grey soup that lay beyond Baker Street. "Dr. Watson," he said with sudden energy, "how would you like a short excursion to Euston Yard, and a few hours among steam and soot?" I stood, my curiosity piqued. "Always ready." Holmes turned to Milbank, his tone brisk. "Have the train held exactly as it arrived. No inspections, no removals, and not a whisper to the press. We'll be at Camden within the hour." Milbank gave a sharp nod and left as swiftly as he had arrived. As Holmes reached for his greatcoat and scarf, he offered me a small smile. "A ghost train, Watson," he said. "That's what the newspapers will call it. But I suspect there is no ghost aboard. Only a man or men who thought themselves terribly clever." And with that we stepped out into the cold, unknowingly at the threshold of one of the most baffling mysteries I had ever witnessed. Holmes was unusually quiet during our cab ride to Euston Yard, his chin resting on the knob of his cane, eyes distant but alert. I had seen that expression before. It was the face of a man who had already begun unraveling a mystery, despite possessing only the barest threads of its fabric. The clatter of hooves and wheels on the cobblestones seemed almost subdued beneath the weight of the puzzle before us. I tried to draw him out. "Holmes, how could a train travel 50 miles without its crew? Surely some mechanical intervention." "There are only 2 reasonable explanations," he interrupted mildly, without turning his gaze from the fogged window. "Either the train was set in motion deliberately, absent of its crew, or the crew was removed en route without halting the train. The first suggests trickery, the second, something more sinister. But to remove an entire crew without stopping..." Holmes offered a faint smile, one that carried no warmth. "Indeed. Which is why we must begin not with theory, but with observation." As we pulled up to the yard, Superintendent Milbank was waiting near the sidings, bundled tightly against the biting wind. The great bulk of midnight number 4017 sat like a sleeping beast across the rails, its engine still faintly ticking from the residual heat of the night's journey. A few workers loitered at a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of unease and curiosity. None dared approach the train. "She's just as she arrived, Mr. Holmes," Milbank said, leading us forward. "I ordered her uncoupled and left alone, per your instructions." Holmes did not respond immediately. He climbed the iron steps into the engine cab, his long fingers brushing against the surfaces, like a pianist reacquainting himself with a beloved but dusty instrument. I followed close behind, careful not to disturb anything. The coal bunker was half empty, consistent with the distance traveled. The throttle lever was pulled fully forward. The brake lever was in its default resting position. Everything was precisely as it should have been, except for the most glaring absence of all. No human had stood here at the moment of arrival. Holmes crouched inspecting the footplate. His eyes narrowed. "No scuffing," he murmured. "No blood, no signs of a struggle. Even the oil lamp is intact." He stepped back and pulled a handkerchief from his coat, carefully lifting a small object from the narrow space between the control levers. It was a matchstick, unburnt but slightly dented along its side. "Curious," he said, showing it to me before tucking it into an inner pocket. We moved next to the coupling between the engine and the freight cars, 20 in all stretching back like iron coffins. Holmes walked the length slowly, inspecting the exterior of each, pausing only to examine the seals. Each one bore the wax stamp of the LNWR, unbroken, untampered. Yet he stopped at the 9th carriage and stared for a long time at a patch of paint, his fingers gently tapping his chin. "Notice anything, Watson?" I peered at the side panel. "Only that it's been cleaned recently. Or perhaps repainted." "Exactly," he said softly. "A hastily done job, uneven color, poorly feathered edges. Someone tried to obscure something here. Possibly a number. Possibly a name." He turned to Milbank. "Was this carriage always part of the number 4017? Milbank furrowed his brow. "To my knowledge, yes. But records can be checked." "Please do," Holmes said, already moving on. "I want manifests, cargo details, and all crew rosters for the last 2 weeks. Anything anomalous, anything at all, must be reported." Holmes next examined the conductor's compartment, a small cabin near the rear of the train where the night log was usually kept. To our surprise, the logbook was open, resting neatly on the desk. He flipped through the entries. The final notation, time-stamped at 2:10 a.m., was in firm handwriting. "Past Rugby. All systems nominal. Visibility low. Engine running smooth." It was signed C. Barker, the train's chief conductor. Holmes examined the ink carefully. Then he sniffed it. Fresh enough to have been written at the time. "But look here." He pointed to the lower margin of the page. A faint smudge trailed off the page just under the final line. He closed the log gently. No sign of violence, no broken locks, but someone went to great lengths to ensure the train continued to appear. Ordinary. Milbank stood near the cabin door, arms folded. Barker was reliable. Been with us 14 years. His engineer, Wallace, too. There's no chance they'd abandon post. Holmes nodded absently, clearly agreeing. Nor would they vanish of their own volition. No, this was planned, calculated. Someone wanted this train to arrive without its handlers, to send a message or perhaps to mask something far more delicate. He turned to face me. "Watson, the sealed cars, though unopened, must still be examined from the outside. Any temperature variations, warping or mechanical abnormalities could be telling." We spent the better part of an hour conducting the most meticulous external inspection I've ever witnessed. Holmes noted 3 things: a faint dent high on the roof of car 12, a broken rivet on the latch mechanism of car 5, and a strange mineral residue, white, chalky, on the coupling between cars 8 and 9. By the time we returned to Milbank, our boots were soaked with thawed sleet and our fingers numbed from the cold. Holmes shook himself free of the wet and requested we be taken to the trainmaster's office. Once inside, he stood silently before the ledger books Milbank brought out, flipping pages rapidly, scanning rosters, train numbers, cargo contents. "Here," he said suddenly, tapping the entry for the previous week's run of the 4017. "Different configuration. This car, number 2942, was not listed then, but it appears today." Milbank leaned closer. "That's the one you pointed out. 9th in line," Holmes's voice fell. "Then someone switched carriages between yesterday and today. A purposeful action. A deception." Milbank's complexion darkened. That indicates that someone had access to the routing schedule and yards. Inside job. Indeed, and I feel the switched carriage may have our answer. We can't open it without breaking the seal, but maybe there's another way. Holmes approached the window and looked out at the line of carriages vanishing into the fog. Then he spoke so softly that I hardly heard it. Whoever did this knew the route intimately. I knew how to time it, and knew the train would arrive at its destination with no living witnesses on board. He returned to us, his eyes gleaming with the old fire of deduction. We're not pursuing a ghost, gentlemen. We're tracking a train without a conductor. Yet it may have delivered or removed something with surgical precision. He paused and coldly continued, "Let us hope it is not both." With that, the second act of this strange affair began. Milbank directed his men to watch the mysterious ninth, carriage number 2942, with tight instructions that no bolt should be removed, until Holmes provided word. Meanwhile, Holmes insisted that we accompany him to the telegraph office located in the yard's administrative block. The fog had begun to lift slightly, from stifling grey to a watery silver, but the air still smelled of coal ash and cold. Inside, Holmes requested urgent wire communication with the rugby signal cabin and, oddly, with a less-used signal box near Weedon, an unexpected stop not on the 4017's regular itinerary. He jotted 2 brief notes ordering the telegraph operator to request confirmation of visual contact at the moment of passage, as well as whether there appeared to be any problems with the engine cab or rear carriage. As we waited, Holmes paced with the meticulous vigor I remembered from our most intense cases. He wasn't just absorbing the facts, we'd already seen his brilliance in action that morning. He was projecting outward, testing the borders of a notion that wasn't quite ready to be voiced out. His fingers danced across the air, as if rearranging unseen chess pieces. "You suspect the ninth carriage was used to remove the crew?" I inquired, finally breaking the silence. "I assume," Holmes stated without pause, "that it was used for something. Perhaps to carry our missing men. Perhaps to smuggle something into their place. Maybe both. But wouldn't that necessitate cooperation from the yard crew? Or perhaps someone at a signal point? Not necessarily. Only access and foresight. The route was known. The schedule is predictable. An individual with access to the sidings and a nighttime window of no more than 10 minutes could make the substitution. It does not even have to be a worker. A contractor, a former employee, a bribed porter. The telegraph machine clacked sharply, attracting everyone's attention. The operator scribbled quickly and handed Holmes the first reply. He read it silently, his brow furrowed. He passed it to me without changing his expression. "Rugby signal box, 2:12 a.m. Train 4017 proceeded without incident. The engine lamps are lighted. No personnel visible in cab. Fog is dense. Train at maximum pace. Confirmed with the lamppost 17 marker. Watson, look again. No crew seen." My pulse quickened. "But that means—" Holmes nodded. "They were gone before Rugby. Or at least hidden. Now let us view the other." The second message arrived minutes later. This one was shorter but far more telling. "Weedon Crossing Keeper. I heard a peculiar clanging at 1:47 a.m. I stepped out. The train passed without a whistle. No crew seen." The brake lamp at the rear flickered. Holmes touched the note, satisfied. "There it is. Weedon. The final uncontrolled portion of the voyage just past Blisworth Junction. The rail twists sharply there. Trees on one side, canal on the other. If one wanted to avoid being observed, this was the ideal location for something to occur. But what could be done while the train was in motion?" I asked. "Surely no one could board or disembark safely." Holmes gave me the look I'd come to expect, a mix of amusement and pity, as one might give a friend who had missed the punchline. "Ah, Watson. You're assuming the incident happened while the train was moving forward." He waited for the notion to settle before proceeding. "There are only 2 reasons for a train to be going quickly without its crew. Either the men vanished from the cab using extraordinary force, abduction or worse, or the train was purposefully set in motion with no intention of being manned until the end. Consider this. What if the perpetrators boarded the train, overpowered the crew, and then jumped off at a predetermined point carrying their quarry with them? A curve, a narrow bridge, a prepared escape route." He rapped his cane sharply against the ground. "The only remaining question is this: why? We returned to the 9th carriage, which was under guard. Holmes asked Milbank for a carpenter's wedge and a long steel rod. "We are not breaking the seal," he said quietly, "but I intend to listen to what this wagon may still be holding." He climbed a small ladder attached to the side and pressed his ear against the upper panel, gently rapping with his knuckles. Then he carefully inserted the steel rod through the ventilation slit. He listened. I held my breath. Then he withdrew the rod and sniffed it. His face remained still, but his eyes darkened. Petroleum. Not strong, but definite. An oily industrial scent, possibly taro. A muffled clink echoed from inside. We both turned to the carriage. Holmes raised a hand for silence. Again a clink. Fainter this time, but unmistakably real. "There's someone inside," I whispered. "Or something," he replied. Holmes called for a crowbar, then stopped himself. "No, we must be cautious. If this is what I suspect, we could be tampering with evidence placed deliberately to mislead." He turned to Milbank. "Superintendent, do you have a safe location, an isolated siding where this carriage can be moved without public attention?" Milbank hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, north end of the yard. Disused engine pit. I'll have her taken there under guard." As the carriage was uncoupled and slowly drawn away, Holmes motioned for me to follow him back toward the office. His face was unreadable. "There is a pattern forming, Watson. Not a theft. Not yet a murder. A message, perhaps. Or a rehearsal. A rehearsal. So of something larger." Once inside, Holmes requested access to the LNWR staff records, particularly those of the missing conductor, C. Barker, and engineer Wallace. Milbank complied without question. While Holmes buried himself in documents, I leafed through the personnel files, noting that both men had unblemished records. Barker was a family man, 2 children, recently recovered from a bout of pneumonia. Wallace had no close relatives, but was described by supervisors as disciplined, humorless, dependable. "There's nothing here, Holmes," I said finally. "Nothing to suggest criminal involvement or desertion." Holmes looked up from the files, his expression sharper now, "which makes their disappearance all the more suspicious." He turned a page, then suddenly stilled. "Watson, here, look at this." I joined him. He was pointing at a line from Wallace's file. "Last known address, 43 Pickering Row, Stoke Newington. Vacated 3 days ago. No forwarding." Holmes tapped it again. Why would an engineer employed steadily and trusted with a freight line vacate his lodgings without warning? And precisely before this incident? We left the yard at once and took a cab to Stoke Newington. The streets narrowed there, lined with tightly packed row houses, many shuttered or crumbling from disuse. Number 43 sat at the end of a terrace, a modest 2-story dwelling with flaking paint and windows darkened from within. Holmes climbed the steps and knocked firmly. No reply. He tried the handle. It was locked, but when he knelt to examine the threshold, he paused, then rose. Fresh scuff marks. Someone left here no more than a day ago. He checked the windows, then moved swiftly around the side, finding a coal chute unlocked. Within moments we were inside. The interior smelled musty, as if long neglected, but recent footprints stained the floorboards. There were crates in the corner. Holmes opened one, empty. He opened another. Inside were railway uniforms, one labelled Rugby Signalman, another Whedon Crossing Attendant. We both stared. Holmes exhaled slowly. So someone impersonated the crew. Someone who understood the route, the timing, and the uniforms. Wallace may never have boarded the train at all. He turned to me with a grim expression. "We are not looking for a disappearance, Watson. We are seeking a staging area. This was orchestrated, practiced, and whoever did it is not yet finished." Outside, the fog was lifting, but the shadows inside Pickering Row only deepened. We left the dark interior of number 43 Pickering Row in a silence more weighty than usual. Holmes' brows were drawn tight, his expression more brooding than contemplative. A rare state for him. The discovery of the false railway uniforms had changed the tone of our investigation. What had begun as a baffling disappearance had now blossomed into something deliberate, something theatrical in its precision. "It is not only the crime that concerns me," Holmes muttered as we returned to the cab. "It is the choreography." We rode in silence for some time, the wheels rattling across North London's damp streets. Holmes sat angled toward the window, tapping a gloved finger on the glass rhythmically. I knew better than to interrupt when he fell into this mode. and so I let my own thoughts wander. The implications were growing darker. Someone with access, knowledge and resources had impersonated signalmen, orchestrated a crew's disappearance, and manipulated the operations of a major freight train line, all without triggering alarm until the final destination. Finally, he stirred. To orchestrate this kind of performance requires rehearsal. This was not done on impulse. We must find where the practice occurred, and more urgently, we must determine if this was the final act or merely the opening scene. Back at Baker Street, Holmes moved with renewed energy. He tore through atlases, rail schedules, and newspaper clippings, scattering periodicals across the floor like autumn leaves. I set a pot of tea on the table, knowing he would ignore it until the leaves went cold. "Watson," he said suddenly, pointing to a map, "note this stretch between Leighton Buzzard and Weedon. Several branches diverge from the main line. One leads to a disused spur, the old Blisworth goods depot. Closed last autumn due to budget cuts. I studied the map. It would be secluded, near enough to the main line for easy access. But how do you propose we investigate it? It's private property, isn't it?" Holmes gave me a crooked grin. "Which is why we shall not go as ourselves. Tonight, we ride as inspectors from the Office of Rail Regulation. Kindly prepare yourself, Watson. Shave your beard. You look far too much the honest doctor." We arrived at the Blisworth depot under moonlight, the old siding cast in sharp angles by a lantern Holmes carried in his gloved hand. The depot was deserted in every practical sense. No night watchman, no operating lines, and only the skeletal remains of cargo sheds and iron struts. Wind creaked through rusted signal posts. A sign that once read, "Blisworth Goods." Restricted access now hung lopsided, its lettering almost illegible. Holmes moved with swift confidence, inspecting the gravel for recent impressions. "Boot prints," he murmured. "Several. Different treads. 2 heavier sets, 1 narrow. Frequent movement here in the past week. Watson, come over here." We rounded the corner of a rotted shed and found what looked to be a temporary structure, a canvas lean-to secured between 2 steel frames, cleverly concealed from the track and road. Inside, under a canvas flap, lay something that made my stomach lurch, a dummy lifelike dressed in a railway engineer's uniform, cap and all. Positioned in a sitting posture, its face was rudimentary, painted on cloth, but the illusion at a distance would pass easily. Nearby lay a conductor's dummy as well, with a false hand attached to hold a logbook in place. Holmes crouched and examined the interior. Sandbags for weight, hinged elbows to support positions, and, look here, wires. The lamps of the cab could be turned on remotely to illuminate the dummies during signal passes. Ingenious. I struggled for words. They rehearsed this here, every detail. The appearance of a manned engine, the logbook, the uniforms. Holmes rose slowly, his voice dark. And if they practiced it here, they likely did more than that. This is a staging ground for something deeper, something still in motion. He moved to the back of the lean-to, brushing aside canvas flaps. I followed. Behind the makeshift cover stood several crates. Holmes cracked one open. Inside lay sacks of finely packed coal, but beneath them, nestled with surgical care, was a layer of straw and something wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled back the covering. Dynamite. My mouth went dry. Good heavens. Holmes closed the crate without a word. Then he turned to me, his tone even. "They used the train to transport explosives, Watson. Undeclared, hidden. The train's true cargo was not what the manifest claimed. This was not a theft, it was an infiltration." I stared at him. "But for what purpose? No detonation, no ransom. Why smuggle it and then disappear?" Holmes's eyes glittered. "Because they were testing the system. Mapping vulnerabilities. Smuggling was secondary. This was an act of observation, a proof of concept." He turned away and began walking back toward the main structure. "And now," he said grimly, "we must learn to whom this information was passed." We returned to London at dawn, faces grey with fatigue and minds heavy with the knowledge of what we had uncovered. While I dozed in the armchair of our sitting room, Holmes scribbled notes furiously, then dispatched 3 telegrams to the Home Office, to Scotland Yard, and to an obscure contact of his in the War Office named Colonel Hesketh. By late morning, a visitor arrived, Inspector Lestrade. He looked unusually pale and agitated, clutching a crumpled sheet of paper. "Holmes," he said without preamble, "we've had a report. Two uniformed men were found unconscious at a canal lock just outside Blisworth. Railway men. Their clothing had been stripped. They'd been drugged, chloroform. One of them's Wallace. The missing engineer, alive? Holmes asked sharply. Lestrade nodded. Barely taken to Northampton General. No memory of what happened after leaving the yard. Holmes exchanged a look with me. Then the real Wallace never touched the train. His uniform was stolen, and the man who wore it, one of our impostors, is still unaccounted for. Which, Lestrade said with a grimace, leads us to this. He handed Holmes the crumpled paper. It was a broadside cheaply printed, in German and English both. The Empire's arteries are exposed. We can stop the trains. Next time we will not leave the carriage empty. Holmes read it aloud in full silence. Then he set it on the fire. Well, he murmured, watching the flames consume the page, it seems our conductorless train was more than a puzzle. It was a warning, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I began to feel the chill of a game not yet finished, and an enemy who had not yet shown their face. Later that same day, Holmes stood motionless at our sitting room window, his fingers steepled just beneath his nose, eyes fixed on the street below, though clearly not seeing it. The remains of the German-English broadside had long since turned to grey ash in the hearth, but the weight of its message lingered in the air like smoke. The Empire's arteries are exposed. That line had struck Holmes with uncommon force. I could see it in the rigidity of his frame, in the distant quality of his voice when he finally spoke. This is no longer merely a question of disappearance or deception. Watson, he said, still without turning, it is a demonstration, a message not merely to the railway but to the government. The culprits sought not to profit but to warn, and perhaps by doing so to invite further alarm. I nodded slowly. A form of psychological warfare? Holmes gave a brief, mirthless laugh. Precisely. To show that the very infrastructure that holds the country together, its iron veins, can be compromised at will. A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes took it without ceremony, broke the seal and read it in silence. Then he gave it to me to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, from Colonel Hesketh, War Office, Internal Security Division. Message, your suspicions confirmed. Foreign agent movements in recent weeks intersect with LNWR shipping manifests. One suspected liaison, Professor Albrecht Rule, recently spotted in Birmingham. Subject believed to have engineering background. History of rail sabotage on the continent. Possible alias R. Vogel. Proceed with caution. Holmes's face remained unreadable, but I detected a flicker in his eyes, as though some hidden piece had finally clicked into place. Professor Rule, I mused aloud. I've seen that name in the army bulletins. A Prussian émigré turned agitator, wasn't he? More than that, Holmes said. He is a technician of disruption. A man who understands that a single delay on a major line can halt regiments, shipments, communication, everything. If he is involved, Watson, then the train was only the beginning. I watched him return to the map still sprawled across the table from the night before. His finger traced the route of the 4017 again, Liverpool to Euston, through Rugby and Weedon. Then he circled the diverging branches once more, especially the stretch near Birmingham. What better place, he said softly, for an orchestrator like Rule to vanish than among the industrial clutter of Birmingham. There are foundries, workshops, hundreds of sidings. A man with the right papers could move freely. Holmes turned sharply. We leave within the hour. True to his word, we boarded a northbound express just past midday. Holmes said little on the journey, though he took time to pen letters to both Lestrade and the Home Office, urging them to place special watch on all outgoing cargo trains from London over the next 72 hours. As we rumbled northward, he gazed out at the bleak winter countryside, the wheels clacking beneath us like a telegraph counting time. We arrived in Birmingham shortly before dusk, the sky hanging low and grey over the city's churning chimneys. Holmes led us directly to an address he had scrawled in his pocket notebook, an unassuming boarding house near the edge of the Digbeth rail yard, where he claimed Rule had once taken lodgings under a false name. We were received by a landlady of formidable girth and a suspicious temperament. R. Vogel, she said, squinting. He took a room here a fortnight ago. Quiet fellow, foreign but polite. Paid cash. Kept to himself mostly. Always out late. Left yesterday morning in a rush. Took only a small case. Did he leave a forwarding address? Holmes asked. She gave a sharp laugh. Not likely. I found this under the bed, though. She handed me a ripped slip of paper, folded into a rough triangle. Holmes unfolded and examined it for a few seconds. It just had a short list of initials and numbers, which appeared to be nonsense. BL3 1440, SJN 22H9WD 3.5, DT4 East Track. Holmes's gaze shifted back and forth over the markings. BL3 must refer to a platform called Birmingham Line 3. The rest could be station codes or yard portions. He folded the paper and placed it in his coat. Watson, we shall visit the yard offices at once. By the time we arrived at Digbeth Yard, it was nearly dark, with the last light of day caught between cranes and gantries like a flame through steel teeth. Holmes presented a fabricated set of inspector's papers he had made en route, a ruse he frequently used with deceptive ease, and sought access to the platform logs for Line 3. The clerk, a timid young man named Brigsley, blinked behind smudged spectacles but agreed. BL3 is used mainly for temporary rerouting, he informed me. Last week it took overflow from Euston due to a signal failure. Mostly freight, grain, timber, some sealed goods from Liverpool, transfers headed for the East Docks. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Were any of those sealed cars connected to outgoing freighters? Brigsley checked the ledger. Yes, sir. Southend Docks received 2 shipments. One was flagged for deferred inspection, marked for review but not logged. I left 2 days ago under urgent classification. Destination? Holmes inquired. Harwich Port, Brigsley said, frowning. Why, sir? But Holmes had already gone. Outside, Holmes paused beside a signal post and retrieved the torn scrap of paper from his coat. HWD, 35, Harwich Dock. 3.5 tons, perhaps. Await, and T4, track 4, east siding. He crushed the paper in his hand. They've already moved the next shipment. The train that arrived conductorless was merely a signal. Now the actual cargo has been sent, hidden in the wake of the confusion it caused. A smokescreen. I felt a sinking sensation. And we don't know what that cargo is. Holmes nodded grimly. We must assume the worst. Weapons, explosives, or worse still, equipment for an act of sabotage yet to unfold. He checked his watch. We have one chance left. If the Harwich freighter hasn't sailed yet, we may still intercept it. Come, Watson. We must telegraph the port authority before another hour passes. We raced through the streets toward the nearest telegraph office, Holmes composing his message as we ran. I had not seen him like this in some time, not merely intent but tense, as though every second mattered more than the last. At the counter, he passed the slip to the operator, who glanced at it and blinked. Urgent. Hold all outgoing vessels. Connected to cargo train arrived from Birmingham. Contents may include undeclared ordnance. Sender. Sherlock Holmes, authorized by War Office. Holmes turned to me then, his face drawn but resolved. If they intercept it, Watson, we may yet avert a disaster, and if they don't... Holmes looked past me toward the blackness gathering at the window. Then the Empire's arteries may not only be exposed, but severed. We left the office in silence, the fog creeping in from the east. And though I could not name the shape of it, I felt the gravity of something enormous circling us in the dark, silent, unseen, and dangerously near. The reply from Harwich Port arrived the following morning at precisely 6 minutes past 5. I was roused by the sharp metallic rattle of the Baker Street telegraph bell and found Holmes already dressed and seated by the hearth, fingers laced, his expression unreadable. The message, when handed to him by the messenger boy, was brief, but its implications were vast. To Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, incoming freighter, Lysander, intercepted as instructed. One rail container discovered mislabeled, cargo listed as industrial piping. Contents instead heavy-grade timing devices, sealed in lead casings. Unknown material beneath cloth sheeting. Dock security detained 2 port workers attempting to flee. No fatalities. Further details to follow. Chief Inspector Hull, Harwich Port Authority. Holmes read the note twice before folding it carefully and setting it beside the flame. He did not burn it this time, only allowed it to absorb the warmth as he stared at the coals with a faraway intensity. The window has not yet closed, he murmured, But we are looking through cracked glass now, Watson. This affair is growing far larger than I'd anticipated. I sat down, blinking the sleep from my eyes. Heavy-grade timing devices. That suggests preparation, not for simple sabotage, but for coordinated destruction. Holmes nodded. Indeed. Devices that operate not on chance, but on engineered delay. These are not the tools of an amateur saboteur, Watson. They are meant to trigger remotely, precisely. Set to cripple multiple targets at once. Possibly rail junctions, possibly naval lines, or something we've not yet considered. He stood abruptly and went to his desk, retrieving a smaller notebook, his personal cipher of cases still unresolved. He flipped to a dog-eared page and ran a finger down a column of foreign names and aliases. He paused halfway down the list. Rule always works with a secondary, he said aloud, more to himself than to me. A man named Tollin, Leonard Tollin. A silent hand. Former military engineer, dismissed for espionage allegations. No record in British employment, but suspected sightings in Antwerp, Brno, and recently Southampton. He turned sharply. Watson, dress quickly. We must speak to Lestrade. The Harwich arrest will not be enough. If Tollin is here in England, he will not remain idle. And he is likely preparing a second move, while the first unravels. By the time we reached Scotland Yard, a steady rain had begun to fall over London, sheeting across windows and pavements with a relentless smearing rhythm. The yard was stirring with early activity, clerks sorting mail, constables returning from the overnight watch, and the low murmur of prisoners being processed in the cells below. We found Lestrade at his desk, bleary-eyed but alert, a stack of documents before him. Holmes, he said by way of greeting. The Harwich incident's got the Home Secretary in a state. He wants answers before Parliament meets. What can I tell him? Holmes sat across from him, long fingers folded across his knee. You may tell him this, the intercepted cargo was only a fragment. A demonstration. That means to draw attention in one direction, while the true threat is being arranged elsewhere. Lestrade frowned. And you have evidence of that? Holmes leaned forwards. Not yet. But I have reason to believe that another container, perhaps more, is already in transit. We're dealing with men who plan weeks in advance and hours precisely. They understand the inspection cycles. They know the locations where containers can be exchanged without drawing attention. Lestrade glanced through his reports. We have detained the 2 dock workers, but they are tight-lipped. They don't appear to be masterminds, but rather hired muscle. Exactly, Holmes responded. That is why we need to look beyond them. One name, Leonard Tollin. If he is in London, we need to find him. He will not be hiding in alleyways. Rather, he will be within reach of the lines he seeks to disrupt. Survey the yards. Maintenance facilities. Warehouses are rented under fictitious names. Lestrade straightened and reached for his folders. All right. I will have him flagged. And I'll notify the port offices. If another suspicious crate travels, we'll know. Holmes stood. We don't have long. If the intercepted container was timed to coincide with something bigger, the countdown has already started. We walked back to Baker Street. Holmes silent the entire time, his gaze concentrated on an unseen thread that only he could see. Once inside, he cleared the table with a sweep of his arm and unfolded a new railway chart. His gaze swept over it quickly. There he finally answered, tapping a location near Greenwich. The Woolwich Military Yards, accessible via rail and dock. A convergence of interests. If one wanted to deal a blow to both the railway network and the munitions supply, he paused. Watson, provide the dispatch file from last fall. The Naval Ledger. Left shelf, red spine. I did so and delivered it to him. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for. Here is an entry from October. Shipment of experimental powder combinations is delayed at Woolwich and redirected via private siding. He looked up, his expression sharpened by sudden urgency. They are targeting the sidings. The containers are not explosives in and of themselves. Rather, they function as conduits, tools for altering existing ammunition. What if they intend to ignite a whole warehouse full of volatile powder? Their contained blast would be catastrophic, but an uncontrolled one. He did not complete the sentence. Within half an hour, we were in a southbound taxi, Holmes holding the telegram he had written in haste to notify both the Royal Arsenal and the yard. The rain had intensified, slamming itself sideways at the window, as if the entire sky was conspiring to delay us. When we arrived at Woolwich, The gates had already been shut by special order from the War Office. The guards saluted as Holmes presented his papers. We were led through a maze of low storage buildings and rusting railroad tracks to a warehouse labeled Restricted, Class C Ordnance. The officer in charge, a pale, tight-lipped lieutenant named Mercer, greeted us at the door. "You're too late," he remarked grimly. "There's a fire." We made a sharp turn as a plume of black smoke rose from the warehouse's rear quarter. Alarms had begun to sound, and men rushed to pump lines and close the corridor between buildings. Holmes moved quickly, pushing past Mercer and ignoring his complaints. We took a detour until we saw where the smoke was coming from. It was not the warehouse yet. It was a rail carriage, an older model. Abandoned, locked tight, flames licked around its undercarriage, burning clean and steady. No larger than a hearth fire, but far more controlled. Holmes dropped to one knee beside the track and sniffed the air. Petroleum starter, crude accelerant. They tried to ignite it, but the rain. "It saved us," he barked to Mercer. "Get this carriage open now, and bring containment cloths." If the contents are what I suspect, a spark could still finish what they began. Within 10 minutes, a crew of sappers had the doors open. Inside lay several long canisters, lead-sealed, marked not with military stamps but with forged trade labels. One had split. Inside were bundles of wire, timers, triggers, and beneath them rolls of parchment soaked in potassium nitrate. Holmes turned to me, rain streaking down his brow. "Fuses, Watson. Not for this explosion, but for another. Somewhere else." He looked toward the warehouse. "They didn't want to destroy the arsenal." "Not yet. They wanted to test its response time. Observe how quickly it seals. Measure how far a fire could spread before containment. And then, softly." They were watching. I felt the full weight of the words settle between us. Holmes rose slowly, glancing into the shadows beyond the fence. "Somewhere nearby," he said. "He's still watching." The smoke from the blazing carriage had started to thin, flowing upward in pale ribbons that mixed with the rain. Holmes stayed motionless, his gaze fixed not on the debris or the canisters being meticulously catalogued by the sappers, but on a line of low warehouses across the yard, partially veiled by fog and gloomy with shadow. His hand unconsciously moved to the brim of his coat, drawing it closer against the wind. "He's here," he said, without looking at me. Or he was. Watching, recording our response times and methods. This entire operation, every burned scrap, every intercepted crate, is a rehearsal. We've been doing our part on his stage. I followed his eyes to the warehouses. They were perfectly situated to view the loading platform and the now charred carriage, with small lanes allowing for a swift escape into the city. I checked the rooflines and windows but found nothing. Holmes abruptly turned and started striding across the yard, his boots splashing through shallow puddles and the hem of his coat trailing behind him like a sail in full wind. I kept up, though it took some effort. He was running with undivided focus now, as if he was following the scent of something just beyond grasp. We circled the back of the last warehouse. Holmes crouched down beneath a series of shattered glass to study the earth. He reached down and took up a wet grey strip of linen with a ripped edge. "Signal cloth," he explained, holding it up. "He used to mark parcels for pickup. Do you see the thread along this edge? It matches the wrapping on the Harwich crate." He arose again, his face furrowed. "Someone was supposed to retrieve it from this side. The fire was more than just a test of response speed. It was to cancel the delivery. Something has gone wrong. The retrieval failed." Above us, a faint metallic click could be heard. Before I could react, Holmes pushed me to the side, and we fell behind a pile of coal sacks, just as a bullet ripped through the air where we were standing. "Rooftop," he exclaimed, removing his handgun from his coat. Another gunshot rang out. It struck the iron side of a nearby water barrel with a sharp clang, erupting in a spray of rust and steam. We crouched lower. From my vantage point, I could only see a dark silhouette moving along the warehouse roof's sloped edge. A man, tall and precise in his movements, with a gun draped across his shoulder like a paintbrush. "No panic, no crazy gestures, controlled." "Only one," Holmes remarked quietly. "He isn't attempting to kill us, Watson. He's trying to slow us down." "Delay our pursuit." Holmes gestured toward a nearby stack of crates. "Flank him from the left. He'll assume we'll both move forward." I hesitated, but the look he gave me was sufficient. I moved quickly through the cover of stacked lumber and coiled cable reels, circling the warehouse's far side. As I approached the eastern stairwell, I heard deliberate footsteps descending quickly. Holmes had been correct. The shooter wasn't waiting to finish the fight. He was retreating, with the same precision he had used in his assault. I rushed to the edge of the building and caught a glimpse of him leaping down the final steps. He turned the corner, vanishing into the narrow alley beyond. Moments later, Holmes was beside me, panting slightly but composed. "We won't catch him on foot," he said, his voice calm but clipped. "But we now know this. He's real. He's present, and he's watching the lines personally. That suggests a weakness. Rule does not usually involve himself in operations directly. This may not be Rule, it may be Tolan." "Then we know who to look for," I said. Holmes nodded. "Yes, and we've seen how he moves, how he thinks. There will be a pattern. He's measuring us, Watson, but now we measure him." Back at Scotland Yard that evening, Lestrade received us with barely concealed astonishment. "You were shot at in a munitions yard," he barked. "Good God, Holmes, do you know what kind of panic this could cause if word got out?" Holmes was already scanning the composite sketches the yard had generated from port reports and railway sightings. He pulled one free, a crude rendering of a long-faced man with pale brows and sunken cheeks, drawn from a clerk's memory in Southampton. "This is our man," Holmes said. "Tolan, likely travelling under an alias, perhaps as a surveyor or dock agent. He's disciplined, military-bearing but not uniformed. Watch the rail yards between Woolwich and Tilbury, and inspect the maintenance depots, especially ones closed for repair or under audit. That's where he'll stage next." Lestrade looked skeptical. "You think he'll strike again?" "After all this?" Holmes fixed him with a level gaze. "He hasn't struck yet. Everything we've seen has been orchestration, set up. When he strikes, Lestrade, there will be no warning shot." That night Holmes barely slept. He paced the floor with a ceaseless rhythm, the back of his notebook now filled with scribbled diagrams, routes, radii, line schedules. At dawn he halted suddenly at the window and said, "He's going to use the inspection train." I looked up from my seat. "What train?" "The auxiliary line inspection run from London to Folkestone. Once a month, minimal guards, flexible schedule. It leaves the depot without public announcement. It's due tomorrow. He'll target it, either to board it or to replace it." "Replace it?" Holmes turned to me. "If he can insert a fake crew and a matching carriage, he can redirect it, fill it with whatever he wishes. Or worse, use it to enter a secure dock line unnoticed." He rang for Mrs. Hudson. "We leave for Folkestone immediately. Send word to Lestrade and to the War Office. The inspection train must be halted, examined, and not allowed to leave until I have verified its crew and contents myself." We were on the road by mid-morning, travelling in a hired coach along the wet southern highway. As the countryside blurred past, Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet. He watched the fences and telegraph poles drift by, as if expecting to see the face of his adversary in every window, every signal box. We arrived at Folkestone Railway Works at lunchtime. The depot master, a stooping man named Harcourt, took us to the inspection train, which consisted of two inconspicuous cars connected by a light locomotive. It sat in a side track, steam slowly curling from its funnel as a mechanic finished oiling the axles. Holmes began by inspecting the taxi. The engineer, Dennett, was present, and his paperwork was in order. He was flanked by Foyle, a conductor who has also been authenticated. Holmes paid close attention to both of them. "Has anyone else been near the train today?" he was wondering. Harcourt scratched his chin. "A man from the audit office arrived here early this morning. He claimed he was reviewing the shipment manifest. Had the correct badge, as far as I could tell. Did he speak with the crew?" "No. I went straight to the rear cabin. Holmes walked to the rear wagon. The door was unlocked. Inside, the environment was immaculate, too clean. No dust or smudges. A new bolt had recently been placed on the rear window. The lock still contained brass shavings. Holmes reached down and removed a little fragment from beneath the bench, a sliver of paper torn along the edge, bearing a fragmentary word, Stein. He stood and turned to face me. "He was here, Watson. Tolan. And he intended to ride this train." "Then we've stopped him," I answered, feeling relieved. Holmes shakes his head. "No, Watson. We have redirected him. He'll move now. Change the target." But we compelled him to reveal his hand, and by doing so, He held up the paper fragment. We may have just found the name of the next station. Holmes inspected the paper piece with the same seriousness as if he were decoding the final lines of an old script. His eyes squinted as he moved the shred between his fingers, inspecting the tear, the faded writing, and the faint water stain at the top edge. Stein, he repeated. The termination of a name or possibly a location. We must conclude that this was not done at random. It was left, most likely torn in haste. But from what? He walked out of the inspection vehicle into a bright but brisk afternoon. The air along the Folkestone sidings had a harsh edge, with the aroma of brine rising from the sea. A signal bell rung softly somewhere inland, with an oddly melancholy rhythmic chime. I followed Holmes to the small yard office where the telegraph logs were stored. Harcourt followed behind, perplexed but obedient. It could be a destination, I suggested. Frankenstein, Silberstein, Bernkastel-Kues, perhaps. A German origin. Possibly, Holmes replied, preoccupied. More likely a British location with Germanic roots, or one that was renamed during the war. Look closer, Watson. Folkestone has historically served as a transportation port. But what's right west of here, down the branch line? He paused, then snapped his fingers. Blenstein Quarry, I blinked. That derelict siding? It hasn't worked in years. Precisely. This means no traffic, no inspections, and, most importantly, no policing. It is an ideal staging area for a final move. Inside the yard office, Holmes requested the previous week's routing schedules. The clerk, too exhausted to disagree with the man's crisp precision, handed them over without complaint. Holmes read through them rapidly. Here, he replied, tapping a column, 3 cars identified as return freights, all logged from Liverpool. However, their routing codes altered at Maidstone and again at Ashford. Unusual. Why alter a code twice? On a straight road unless you don't want anyone to follow it. Where are they now? He pointed to the entryway. Shunted to holding by sundown, on a side track near Blenstein. Not officially, of course. Nobody would challenge overnight storage. He turned to face Harcourt. How many men do you have who can be trusted not to speak a word? Harcourt blinked. 4. Maybe 5. Good. You will send 2 to secure the west switch at Blenstein. Quietly. Tell them only that it is a theft deterrent exercise. And us? I inquired. Holmes handed me a pair of dark coats, railway issue but worn and muddy. We're heading inside. Tonight. The hours before dusk passed in hushed solitude. Holmes and I sat on a rusty signal tender with a modest engine designed to move us without drawing attention. We kept our lamps low, and Holmes passed the time by examining and rechecking a bundle he'd packed. His pistol, a small mirror, 2 coil fuses, and an oilskin pouch with a pair of signal flags, 1 red, 1 black. If the siding is active, he explained, they will expect someone to arrive at night. Tollen will not arrive by rail this time. He will approach on foot or with a cart. We'll place ourselves inside one of the parked automobiles. If he enters, we will listen. If he stays, we will act. And if he brings others. Holmes flashed me a strained smile. Then we'll have company. But no more surprises. By the time we arrived at the outskirts of the abandoned Blenstein siding, the light had faded to a dim violet, and the clouds hung low like ink drops bleeding into a sponge. The line abruptly splits here, disappearing into a gully surrounded by embankments and low vegetation. The lines were rusted, but the rail bed had recently been cleared, with fresh stones put and weeds tamped down. Someone had been preparing this. Holmes exited first, crouched low and going around the side of the next freight car. It was labeled with fake identification, the stencil amateurish and the paint fresh. This one, he muttered. Empty but sealed. It will do. We climbed inside through a rear maintenance latch. Inside, the area smelled of iron and sawdust. Holmes unrolled a length of fabric and put it against the small window slats, darkening the space even further. Then we waited. Time passed in the languid, erratic rhythm of the night. A fox called out in the distance. The faint chime of a bell wafted through the gloom. Holmes said nothing, just listened. I could see the muscles in his jaw tense and relax, his body calm but electrified, like a coiled wire waiting for current. Finally, footsteps. 3 sets. Holmes indicated with 2 fingers to be silent. The voices that followed were muffled yet close. The delay at Harwich was not planned. Rule is not happy. It did not matter. They witnessed the answer. They measured the security. A third voice, quieter yet crisper. Focus. This automobile contains the second fuse. The Woolwich run was simply a calibration test. This will disrupt the coastline for days. Holmes slowly turned to face me and mouthed the word, fuse. Then he moved to the back of the car, his hand on the latch. He waited until the sounds moved around the rear, then with a single action threw the door open and burst out into the dark. I followed at immediately. "Tollen," Holmes shouted, "drop it." "You are surrounded." The men froze. 3 figures, one carrying a satchel, one clutching a bundle of wires, and the third slowly reaching into his coat. Holmes has his revolver drawn. "Don't," he cautioned. "Not unless you wish to see how fast my aim really is." The tallest person turned, his face catching the moonlight just enough to reveal the high cheekbones, tiny eyes, and white blonde fringe across the brow. "Tollen," Holmes said, his voice low and steady, but Tollen just smiled. "You were faster than I expected." "You should have expected it, and yet you came with only him." He looked at me with scorn. Holmes shrugged. "I didn't want to frighten you." One of the other males shifted slightly. Holmes fired a shot not intended to strike but close enough to break the hush. The man froze. "Back away from the satchel," Holmes instructed. "Slowly." But Tollen's gaze never left Holmes. "This isn't the end," he explained. "You can intercept a train, delay a blast. However, the idea has already been planted." Holmes stepped forward. "Then let me remove it." A piercing whistle rang out from the ridge behind us at that very instant. Lestrade and 2 constables appeared, weapons in hand and lamps swinging. Tollen's men dropped their bags. Only Tollen stood unmoving, his eyes frigid. Holmes stepped forward and handcuffed himself. "You've rehearsed your finale," he said quietly, "but the theatre is closed." Tollen remained mute, but the tiniest twist of his mouth revealed something more than wrath. Resignation. As he was brought away, Holmes knelt by the satchel. He carefully unlatched it. There were not only explosives inside, but also blueprints, siding maps, network overlays, and ink symbols. He held them up to the lantern. "All of it," he mumbled. "Each step, every plan. This was not a single performance, Watson. It was a doctrine." I glanced at the pages with a sorrowful heart. "Then it's over?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "No, but for tonight, we've hit the brakes." The return journey to London was conducted in silence. Holmes sat across from me in the compartment, his gaze concentrated on the raindrops creeping across the window pane. The movement of the train reflected dimly in the brass fittings surrounding us. Outside, the English countryside passed in long, dreary stretches, bare hedgerows, waterlogged fields, distant chimneys trailing smoke into a sky that appeared scraped thin. It was only as the lights of Clapham Junction flared into view that Holmes stirred. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers behind his chin in that distinctive stance that always indicated the start of a deeper synthesis. "Tollen," he stated gently, "was not the architect. He was the executioner. Yes, I am an engineer by trade, but I am not the man who created the doctrine." "You mean rule?" I inquired, though I had already guessed the answer. Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes. Rule designed, shaped, and laid the framework for our rail system like a surgeon mapping arteries. Tollen just followed the directions, precise calibrated sabotage enough to expose fault lines, not destroy them." I frowned. "But if we've arrested Tollen, intercepted the carriages, and secured the blueprints, we've stifled the play," Holmes said. "Not dismantled the theatre." He leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. Rule would never have approached the crime scene. He would have watched from a distance, gauged our reaction, and fled as soon as we began to close in. I assume he departed. England 3 days ago, possibly before the Woolwich event. Tollen remained behind to carry out the ultimate act, scattering the trail. I was silent for a moment. "Then this may begin again?" Holmes opened his eyes. "Not in the same way. The element of surprise is depleted. But yes, Rule has not given up. He will adjust, refocus, shift strategies. That's what men like him do. The train entered Victoria Station through a drizzle. The platform was almost deserted, with the gas lamps throwing long golden pools on the slippery cobblestones. Lestrade greeted us with an envelope in his hand and a relieved, almost triumphant expression. "Word spreading through the yard," he continued, handing Holmes the letter. "The Home Secretary has already briefed Parliament. Military intelligence is currently examining Tolland's materials." "You did it, Holmes." Holmes opened the seal and scanned the letter's contents. Whatever satisfaction he may have felt was tightly concealed. He folded the sheet once, then twice, and tucked it inside his coat. "Official thanks," he murmured without excitement, "and the assurance that no mention of the incident will be made to the public." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "Isn't that the best way? It makes no reason to cause alarm. Most people have no concept how fragile the rail infrastructure actually is." Holmes studied him for a long time. "Precisely. That is what makes it so appealing to men like Rule." We left without saying anything, the fog burying Lestrade's silhouette behind us. Back at Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson greeted us with steaming tea and professions of concern, which Holmes avoided with vague mutterings of a man already drifting back into abstraction. He took a seat near the hearth and remained still for quite some time. The firelight flickered across his face, creating sharp angles and hollow shadows. I sat in the chair opposite, simply watching him, waiting for his thoughts to form words. Finally he spoke. "Did you notice something, Watson, about the blueprints?" I shake my head. "Only that they appeared thorough." "Almost obsessionally so." Holmes nodded. "They were. But one detail has bothered me. Each schematic, each line, featured a repeated motif near the switching yards. A little encircling cross, not part of any conventional railway notation." He rose and took the folder from the desk, opening it to the page he had highlighted. "This one," he pointed. "Bletchley Junction. And here Southampton and again in York. All are identified with the same symbol, and yet none of those locations were part of Tolland's prescribed actions." I leaned in. "Then they're future targets?" "No," Holmes said, a peculiar gleam in his eyes. "They are assets. Look at the similarities. They're all sidings leased to commercial freight businesses, non-government. However, they are all located near military routes." I got a cold. "He was embedding sympathizers." Holmes looked at me and lowered his voice. "He was preparing a network. Watson, this is not a case of sabotage, but of access. If he had succeeded, Rule would have left behind an apparatus that could infiltrate British supply lines at will. Customs would only see routine shipments. Schedules would remain unchanged. However, an unmarked automobile may easily get past." He closed the folder gently. "Tolland failed. But the system endures. Yes, it is incomplete, but it has been seeded." We sat silently again. A blast of wind tapped at the window, rattling the panes slightly. The fire hissed as a wood moved in its cradle. "And now?" I asked gently. Holmes offered a slight smile. "Now we begin the slow work, Watson. We dug. We track every manifest, every unexpected leasing change, and every freight name that emerges without context. And we keep an eye on Rule's movements because he will reappear." I took a deep breath. "It feels as if we've prevented a war no one knew had begun." Holmes nodded. "That is the nature of these wars. They are fought silently in the shadows and without fanfare, but no less real." He stood, walked to the window, and gazed out at the fog-covered street. "This case," he explained softly, "was never about a single train. It was about the appearance of control. The moment we begin to feel our systems impenetrable, that is when we are most vulnerable." I rose as well, moving to his side, and yet we stopped them. He looked to me. And I caught a flash of warmth behind his eyes. "Yes, Watson," he answered. "This time we stopped the train. The following morning brought with it a pale, hesitant sun that filtered gently through the lace curtains of Baker Street, softening the memory of recent events, but not erasing them. I awoke to the familiar scent of boiled coffee mingling with coal smoke, and the steady scratch of Holmes's pen from his desk in the corner. He had clearly not slept. When I approached, I found him hunched over a series of telegraph receipts, neatly annotated railway manifests, and 3 fresh sketches he had drawn by hand, each showing some subtle variation of the mysterious encircled cross that had marked the blueprints. Taken from Tolland's satchel, These are not symbols of attack, Holmes murmured, not looking up. They are placeholders. I leaned in, still groggy. Placeholders for what? For leverage, Watson. He tapped the edge of one drawing. Rule was building a network that didn't need to explode. It needed only to exist. The knowledge that such a thing could be triggered at any time would paralyze logistics, force military planners to second-guess every dispatch. The idea was the weapon. And Tollin? I asked. Was he to maintain the system? Activate it later? Holmes sat back slowly, fingers templed beneath his chin. Possibly. Or perhaps there are others like Tollin already placed. Cell leaders unaware even of one another. It is in essence a decentralized design, ingenious. He looked toward the fire, as though trying to read patterns in its flicker. It mimics the very structure of the railway system itself, distributed, branching, independently managed. Rule wasn't just targeting infrastructure. He was mirroring it. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that came whenever Holmes's deductions reached too far ahead of me to follow entirely. But if that's true, I said, then what we intercepted wasn't a finale, it was an overture, a test of concept. And if the system still exists, then Britain's railway arteries remain vulnerable, Holmes finished for me. Not to bombs, but to uncertainty. There was a knock at the door, swift, firm, familiar. Holmes didn't even glance up. Lestrade, Mrs. Hudson ushered the inspector in moments later. He looked unusually somber for a man who had just secured the arrest of an international saboteur. I've news, he said, closing the door behind him. The blueprints you recovered from Tollin. There's a fourth one. Our analysts missed it at first, tucked in the lining of his satchel. He handed over a folded sheet. Holmes took it wordlessly and unfolded it on the desk. It was a simplified schematic, a stretch of track branching off from the main Midlands route. The labeling was sparse, no station names, no dates, just a sequence of switches and sidings marked in red ink, and at the very end of the line a black diamond. Not a cross. A diamond! Holmes's brow furrowed. This is different. It gets worse, Lestrade said. Our contact at the War Office recognized that shape. It matches the schematic layout of the Braintree testing range, closed since the war, but the underground storage facilities are still intact. Holmes looked up. And still stocked? Lestrade nodded grimly. Powder reserves, detonators, sealed shells awaiting decommission. Holmes stood. Then Rule's real target was never the docks, nor the Woolwich run. He was distracting us, testing the system to ensure that when the true shipment moved, it would go unnoticed. He stepped quickly to the map pinned above the mantel, dragging his finger from Folkestone to Braintree in a diagonal cut. It fits. Every diversion, every delay. Tollin's failure at Woolwich ensured we would concentrate on port-based sabotage. And the Braintree line? I asked. Lestrade sighed. We haven't monitored it in years. It's unstaffed. Just old track and shuttered depots. Holmes turned sharply. Then we have no time. He moved faster than I'd seen in days, throwing on his coat and retrieving his revolver from the drawer. Watson, fetch your kit. Lestrade, order a blockade of the Braintree branch line. Stop every train along the Essex route quietly. No headlines. If there's a false car moving toward that depot, it must be intercepted before it reaches the sidings. But how will we find it? I asked as I pulled on my boots. Holmes tapped the fourth blueprint once. He's marked the switches in red. There are only 5 along that stretch. If we monitor them, we can see which car deviates and where it leads. Within the hour, we were aboard a special dispatch engine loaned by the yard, steaming north along the Midland line with a small team of plainclothes officers. Holmes stood near the front, coat flapping as he leaned out into the wind, his eyes locked on the landscape ahead. By the time we reached the second switching point, the light was fading. Dusk rolled over the fields like a slow tide. At each stop, we signaled to a waiting constable to remain hidden and report any movement. It was near the fourth switch, Grantham's Hollow, that we found it, an unmarked freight car. Alone on a siding, no engine, no crew. Holmes leapt from the train before it fully halted and approached the car slowly, revolver drawn. I followed, heart pounding. The car's markings had been sanded away. The wheels still bore the dust of movement. And the lock, standard, but recently forced and replaced with a newer latch. Holmes signaled for the officers to spread out. Lestrade approached from the far side, panting. This it? Holmes nodded. I believe so. He produced a length of wire from his coat, inserted it into the latch, and sprang the lock in under 10 seconds. The door creaked open. Inside, stacked in careful rows and strapped to steel supports, were 26 cylindrical canisters. All unmarked, but it was what lay atop them that chilled me. A single folded sheet, the same symbol, a black diamond drawn in heavy ink. Holmes picked it up, unfolded it, and there, written in neat slanted German script, was a message. You've proven your vigilance. But systems age, gentlemen, and vigilance fades. I need only wait. Holmes stared at it for a long time before folding it again. It's not a message for us, he said softly. It's a reminder for himself. Lestrade gave the order to clear the area. The canisters were transferred under heavy guard to the ministry's disposal teams, and as the night deepened, the air filled with the sound of boots on gravel, the distant pulse of signal bells and the faint, persistent whistle of trains passing in the dark, an empire of motion, unwittingly haunted by the memory of what almost came to pass. We returned to Baker Street in silence. At last, seated once again by the fire, Holmes lit his pipe and stared into the embers. Sometimes, he said quietly, the most dangerous weapon is not the device itself, but the idea that it could exist at all. He exhaled slowly. And that idea, he added, will not leave our railways soon. It was several weeks before the threads of the case were finally drawn together, knotted and set aside in Holmes's archive. The newspapers never reported the matter, of course. Official channels deemed it too sensitive for public consumption. Instead, the arrest of Leonard Tollin was quietly attributed to immigration fraud, and the seized freight was marked as an unauthorized industrial shipment lost to bureaucratic error. The truth of it, the train that had run without a conductor, the orchestration of a silent network of subversion, remained, as so many of our cases did, in the confidential ledgers of Scotland Yard and Holmes's own locked tin box marked sensitive. Class AI found him one late morning standing by the window, a letter from the War Office folded neatly in his hand. His gaze wandered not toward the street below, but rather to some far abstract place that existed only in the corridors of his mind. They've confirmed Rule's departure, he said without turning. 3 days before the Braintree container was discovered. Boarded a steamer under false papers from Hull. By now he's likely back on the continent, free, watching. I poured coffee and joined him. And what do they intend to do? Monitor the borders, revise the manifest system, install new signaling protocols, he said with a small shrug. Locks upon doors that have already been opened, Watson, but still better than nothing. We sat in silence for a time. Outside, carriages passed. Children called to one another beneath the crisp spring sky. The world seemed untroubled again, restored to its orderly rhythm. But I saw it in Holmes's eyes, the knowledge that the restoration was delicate, easily shaken. He rose at length and moved to the corner table, where the fourth schematic still lay open. He circled the black diamond once more with his finger. He could have destroyed it all, Holmes murmured. The timing devices, the containers, the arsenals. But he chose not to. Instead, he showed us a shadow. Why, I asked. Why go to such elaborate lengths just to demonstrate a threat? Holmes tapped the paper gently. Because fear is a currency, Watson, and Rule is a banker of terror. He understands that a nation preoccupied by its own fragility becomes more easily manipulated. Less daring, less united. He meant to divide not by violence but by doubt. He closed the file then, locking it with a brass clasp and sliding it into the cabinet marked Railway Critical. And just like that, it was over. Tollin was remanded to military custody. The blueprints were dismantled and their corresponding sidings secured. The ministry installed new encryption protocols for train route changes, and within a month, a handful of previously overlooked employees at remote depots were quietly removed from service. But Holmes remained vigilant. Each week he scanned the freight columns. He visited sidings under false names, and he kept a small envelope tacked to the back of our sitting room door. Inside it, the note left in the Braintree car. You've proven your vigilance. But systems age, gentlemen, and vigilance fades. I need only wait, sometimes late at night. I would find him staring at it, not with dread, but with a kind of respect. He left it as a challenge, I said once, unable to keep the thought to myself. Holmes turned to me then, the faintest glint of a smile in his eyes. Yes, he said, and it would be discourteous not to accept. He returned to his chair by the fire, the newspaper in one hand, so fresh problem no doubt already forming in the other. And so the case of the train that returned without a conductor passed into the shadows with so many others. It left no headline, no trial, no monument, only a quiet place in the history of threats averted, and a single, chilling truth, that the tracks we ride in peace are often kept safe not by fortune or policy, but by the vigilance of those few who hear the danger in the silence between the wheels.